All right, so let's talk about using what materials you have available to think about color and everything. So we've practiced this drawing, taking an object, breaking it down into its parts, right? Translating that into a drawing. And you know, I'm happy with how this has turned out. Now I want to practice using different materials with this. So I'm going to recreate this drawing multiple times, and I could just make a copy of this. So it kind of depends on like what is your priority, right? So is your priority developing drawing skills, in which case you need to draw this each time, because the more you draw, it's really about developing the hand-eye coordination and the just like the muscle memory. Now, if your interest is really more working on using the materials, then maybe you do make a copy, right? Ultimately, I would probably do a little bit of both. I would do maybe 4 hand-drawn pieces, and then I might make a copy of that, and that gives me at least 8 options, right? And I'm not looking for exact, you know, copies each time, right? So I am just kind of getting a general shape here, because even though I do want to practice my drawing skills, if this exercise is about using my materials, then I don't need to put too much emphasis on repeating the exact same thing. And then I'm going to go over them with a fine tip marker. But you could also absolutely use just a regular pen. That would be great as well. So as I was still working off of my reference image, but you can see that, you know, I kind of played around with ways that I could do this, and you could do this to extremes, right? So if you really wanted to get like more kind of like cartoony or abstract, you could play around with this and with your variations. So I find that these variations can be really helpful in that regard. So now I need to think about what materials do I have. So, you know, maybe you have a crayon or a color pencil or a highlighter or markers, pencils, regular pens, right? There's lots of choices, and even if you only have 2, you can totally do a lot with this. So I'm just gonna, for each one of these, do a different kind of example of how I might utilize 1 or 2 materials. I will say that I like to combine at least 2 most of the time, because I find that that gives a little more of a dynamic look, especially if I have kind of limited materials. So let's kind of start with my highlighter. Anytime you use any sort of marker, you want to think about the direction of your, you know, strokes, because you will most likely see those, right? So because this is a really linear object, right? It's a really upright cactus. I want to treat my lines the same. In this case, even though I use Sharpie, it looks like it's bleeding through a little bit, so just something to pay attention to. Maybe I want to really take advantage of that and kind of try and get it to bleed a little more in some areas. Maybe I want to know that I need to be a little gentle with it as I'm working. So I could just leave it like this, right? Like this is nice. But maybe I want to add a little bit more shading. So you can see I kind of alluded to that here. Maybe I want to go back in with my pen and do some cross hatching. And again, cross hatching is where I am, well, hatching is just like a line like this. Cross hatching is, as it explains, you're crossing over. So I could do just some regular hatching to show the shading, or I could cross hatch, especially if I want to show like a really darker area. So, you know, don't forget about that reference, either image that you took or having your object in front of you so that you can refer to it. If you have your object in front of you, pay attention to the lighting. If it's natural daylight, is that changing? Because that will change the shadows, right? So maybe I want to try working with color pencil, and you might practice how you use this, because how hard you press with it will make a difference. So I can work really lightly, I can press really hard, I can cross hatch but while shading and get a little more density, right? So think about how you might want to use your materials on your actual piece, right? So I'm gonna go over the whole thing a little bit. And then I might come back and think about adding, you know, darker areas. And you know, this piece in particular, I've already outlined everything with my fine tip marker or my ballpoint pen. So I've already done some of this work in terms of shading. And that kind of goes back to the idea that it can be really nice to mix your materials, right? And you can see how I did that further with my highlighter or, again, any kind of marker. So you could do that here. I could also keep it just fairly minimal. Maybe I just want to have it really subtle. Or maybe I want to come back in, say I do have a marker or a highlighter, and I want to use that for a darker area, but I don't want to use it in every area like I did over here. Maybe I want to use this to really pop out some areas, right? So you could use it in this way, almost using it as highlights. And, you know, depending on how many materials you have available, you could really go to town, right? Maybe I'm going to also use crayons. So again, I talked about before how you can mix your materials and that can add some interesting depth. And these kind of practice squares are really allowing you to do that. And you also have the exterior of the squares to practice even further before committing. All right, what happens if I use crayon first and then I go over that with a marker or a highlighter? How does that look different than the other way around if I had a highlighter and then I went over it with crayon? What if I bring in a different color, if I happen to have a different highlighter or marker? How does that change the tone, especially if I'm going, say, a green or a yellow and a blue? They're all kind of in the same color family, because remember, if I take blue and I add yellow, I'll get green. So even if you only have one or two colors, you can start to mix them in different ways, and that's going to give you a different effect, right? So I'm almost creating a purple here. I'm going to repeat for each of these a few different ways of adding color and design and texture. So you could also think about the background. Do you want to play around with the background? Also, what about density, right? So we've done a lot of cross-hatching. Not a lot, but I've done some cross-hatching to create shading and density. You could also think about swirls. And that's another way to create color. I probably wouldn't use it for this specific design because of how linear it is, but maybe I want to use it for like a background and really create like a very dense dark background around my piece. It doesn't have to cover the whole area, but maybe some of it, right? Right, so think about that. You could also use your marker. If I have green and maybe I want to use a pink or a blue or something, and sorry, it doesn't have to be a marker, really anything, but I want to use a kind of really contrasting color to really pop this a lot more, right? I can outline it. And am I covering the whole surface, or am I kind of like letting it fade out in some areas, so I'm only doing some sides of it? So all of a sudden, my kind of like general drawing has a lot more visual interest depending on how I combine my materials and use them, and what color combinations I'm using, what densities I'm creating with hatching or swirling, and I can really have limited materials and yet a dynamic end result. So I challenge you to really, play around with this. What can you do? What do you have available, and how can you use them? And also, it could also be a wet media. This is on regular paper, so I'm going to use a little bit of watercolor. The thicker you have your paper is, the more it will accept your material. But, watercolor works. And again, it doesn't have to be watercolor like traditional watercolor. You could see, do you have any food dye in your kitchen, or any markers that if you add water to, maybe that will work as well. So maybe I take this one. What do my highlighters do if I add a little water to them? Because this is a thin paper, if I scrub too much, it's going to start scrubbing a hole in it. But if I treat it kind of gently, I can almost create this wash with my markers because they are water-based. So don't be afraid to really try to push your materials and their possibilities, because this is meant to be like a low risk exercise and a high reward. There's not any wrong answers besides not doing anything. So go ahead and get started. Go do something and see what you end up with.